Did you know the French government banned its most important World War II documentary from television for 12 years? While Hollywood glorified Allied heroism, French filmmakers dared to expose their nation's darkest secret, that thousands of citizens actively collaborated with Nazi occupiers. These films weren't just censored. Some directors received death threats and were branded traitors. Let's expose the hidden masterpieces France desperately tried to bury. Le Corbeau, The Raven, 1943, created the most controversial film in French cinema history by exposing small-town hypocrisy during Nazi occupation. Le Corbeau follows anonymous poison pen letters terrorizing a provincial French town, revealing its citizens' darkest secrets and destroying lives. The real scandal? Clouseau made it under Continental Films, a Nazi-controlled production company, while France was still occupied. After liberation, Clouseau was branded a collaborator and banned from filmmaking for life, a sentence later reduced to just 2 years after filmmakers protested. The French resistance literally wanted him executed. Critics originally condemned it as anti-French, claiming it portrayed the French as petty, vindictive informers, exactly what many became under Vichy. The film's production supervisor was actually executed for collaboration. The wild irony? A film about anonymous denunciations led to Clouseau himself being denounced. Today, film scholars recognize Le Corbeau as a subversive masterpiece that used Nazi funding to criticize the very culture of denunciation the Nazis encouraged. Alfred Hitchcock was so impressed, he hired Clouseau's team for his own films and borrowed heavily from its visual style. As critic Pauline Kael later wrote, Clouseau turned Nazi propaganda money into the most damning portrayal of fascist psychology ever filmed. La Bataille du Rail, The Battle of the Rails, 1946. René Clément's revolutionary film used actual French, railway workers, and real derailed trains to recreate resistance sabotage operations just months after liberation. Shot in documentary style with non-professional actors who had actually fought against the Germans, La Bataille du Rail was one of the first films to portray the French resistance, but with a calculated political agenda. What the government tried hiding? The film was officially sanctioned by France's new communist-influenced leadership, specifically to glorify working-class resistance, while completely erasing the complex reality of collaboration. The communists needed heroes, and railway workers delivered. The film shows brutal Nazi reprisals, including a harrowing scene of resistance fighters being tortured that was nearly cut for being too realistic. Critics initially hailed it as truthful cinema, but historians later exposed it as carefully crafted propaganda, designed to mythologize selective resistance, while ignoring the uncomfortable fact that most French people simply accommodated occupation. Director Clément later admitted, "We weren't making history. We were making the legend France needed to heal." The film won the International Jury Prize at the first Cannes Film Festival in 1946, a festival specifically created to compete with Venice, which had become associated with fascist influence. Section Spéciale, 1975, delivered a sledgehammer blow to France's judicial reputation with this clinical examination of the Vichy government, creating an actual, retroactive court to execute innocent French citizens as revenge for resistance killings. Based on documented events from 1941, it depicts how judges and lawyers willingly perverted the law to please Nazi authorities after resistance members assassinated a German officer. The film's most disturbing revelation? Many of the judges who sent innocent men to die remained in power after liberation, with some serving in high government positions into the 1972. The French Ministry of Justice actively tried blocking the film's research team from accessing official records. When Costa Gavras finally obtained documents proving judicial murder, government officials claimed they were isolated incidents. Critics were stunned by Michael Lonsdale's chilling performance as the justice minister, who calmly explains why legal murder is necessary for maintaining good relations with German authorities. The film won Best Director at Cannes, but was minimized in French media coverage. As Costagavra stated in interviews, these weren't Nazi monsters, but French professionals in suits who decided murder was simply administrative work. The French Bar Association condemned the film without addressing its factual accuracy, a deliberate attempt to undermine public confidence in judicial institutions. Au revoir les enfants, 1987. Louis Malle waited 40 years to tell his most personal story, witnessing his Jewish classmate being dragged away to Auschwitz from their Catholic boarding school. Based on Malle's childhood experience in 1944, the film depicts how a priest hid Jewish children under false identities, a moment that haunted Malle his entire life. The film's devastating power comes from showing how an act of petty revenge by a resentful employee resulted in the murder of innocent children. What governmental authorities hated. Malle's unflinching portrayal of everyday French anti-Semitism and casual betrayal that made the Holocaust possible. The French Education Ministry initially hesitated to approve school viewings, claiming the film was too complex for young audiences, meaning too honest about French complicity. Critics universally praised the film, which won 7 César Awards and the Golden Lion at Venice. The film's most gut-wrenching scene shows the Gestapo officer thanking the priest in French, telling him, "There are no more Jews in this school," as Malle's childhood self watches powerless. As Malle explained, "This isn't a historical film. It's my testimony to the moment I lost my innocence about my country." When asked why he waited decades to tell the story, Malle simply replied, "France wasn't ready to hear it before." Grain et la pitié, the sorrow and the pity. Marcel Ophuls detonated a 4.5-hour documentary nuclear bomb that shattered France's carefully constructed resistance myths by interviewing actual citizens about what really happened during occupation. Focusing on Clermont-Ferrand, a town where both Vichy government and resistance operated, Ophuls exposes how ordinary French people behaved, from active collaboration to passive accommodation to genuine resistance. The film's impact was so devastating that French state television, which had actually commissioned it, refused to broadcast it until 1981, 12 years after completion. ORTF executives explained the ban by saying, "The film destroys myths the French still need." The documentary includes jaw-dropping interviews with unrepentant collaborators sitting comfortably in their living rooms, explaining why they turned in Jews and resistance fighters. Critics recognized it as revolutionary, with American reviewers particularly stunned by its honesty. After commercial cinema showings became surprise hits, the film transformed French historical consciousness virtually overnight. Its most damning segment features resistance hero Emmanuel Dastier de la Vigerie admitting 3% of the French were resistors, 3% were collaborators, and the rest were chameleons who changed color according to who was winning. When finally broadcast on television in 1981, it attracted a record-breaking 15 million viewers, proving the government had underestimated the public's readiness for truth. L'Armée des Ombres, Army of Shadows. Himself a former resistance fighter, delivered the most brutally realistic portrayal of resistance life ever filmed, showing not heroic victories, but the soul-crushing weight of fear, betrayal, and necessary murders of their own members. Based on Joseph Kessel's novel, the film follows a resistance cell led by Lino Ventura's character as they navigate occupied France while facing constant betrayal and the psychological toll of living in shadows. The film's most haunting scene shows resistance members executing one of their own who was caught and might break under torture, depicting the resistance not as romantic heroes, but people forced to commit terrible acts to prevent worse outcomes. What the government hated? Melville refused to create propaganda heroes, instead showing resistance fighters as isolated, terrified individuals making morally compromising decisions without clear victories. The film was a commercial failure upon release, with French critics dismissing it as outdated and overly grim. It wasn't released in America until 200637 years later, where it was hailed as a masterpiece. Melville, who wore his actual resistance member registration number on his costume as a film extra, later said, "The resistors who hated my film were the ones who joined when it became safe in 1944. Director Christopher Nolan cited it as a major influence on Dunkirk, particularly its portrayal of survival as victory in itself. Monsieur Klein, Mr. Klein, 1976. Joseph Losey's psychological thriller stars Alain Delon as Robert Klein, a Catholic art dealer profiting from Jews until he discovers another Robert Klein, who is Jewish, has used his identity. Losey crafts an increasingly nightmarish descent, as Delon's character becomes obsessed with finding his doppelganger while authorities begin suspecting him of being Jewish himself. The film's most terrifying aspect is showing how quickly proven Frenchness could evaporate during Vichy rule. What angered authorities? Losey explicitly shows French police, not Germans, enthusiastically rounding up Jews during the infamous WWII Roundup, where 13,000 Jews were crammed into a cycling stadium without food, water, or toilets before deportation to death camps. When released, government officials complained the film exaggerated French police involvement, despite historical records proving the opposite. Critics praised Delon's against-type performance as a man discovering his own morality too late. The film won the Crita César Award for Best Film, but underperformed commercially because, as Losey noted, French audiences didn't want to see their handsome movie star caught in the machinery of their own moral failure. The film's final devastating scene shows Delon's character, now mistakenly identified as Jewish, being loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz, having become victim of the very system he once exploited. Night and Fog, 1956. Alain Resnais created the first major documentary about Nazi concentration camps just 10 years after liberation, using devastating footage and a poetic narration that asks viewers not just to witness horror but question how it happened. Running just 32 minutes, it combines current footage of abandoned camps with actual Nazi documentation of atrocities in a meditation on memory and responsibility. What the government censored. French authorities demanded Resnais remove a single frame showing a French policeman guarding a detention camp for Jews before deportation, proof of French participation in the Holocaust. Resnais was forced to blur the policeman's distinctive kepi hat in French releases, though the unaltered version showed internationally. The film also faced attempted diplomatic suppression when West Germany tried blocking its screening at Cannes to avoid damaging its international image. Critics called it the most important documentary ever made, with François Truffaut saying, "A viewing should be mandatory for every human being." The film's most brutal technique is its jarring cuts between peaceful, overgrown current-day camps and historical footage of emaciated bodies being bulldozed into mass graves. As narrator Michel Bouquet warns in the film's most chilling line, those who pretend this was all in another time are closing their eyes to what surrounds us still. La ligne de démarcation, the démarcation line, explores life along the due, actual boundary that split France in two, the Nazi-occupied north and the free southern zone controlled by the Vichy regime. Based on Colonel Remy's memoirs, a famous resistance agent, the film depicts how the artificial border created moral choices for ordinary people caught between collaboration and resistance. What makes the film uniquely disturbing is showing how the demarcation line physically manifested France's moral division, with citizens making life or death choices about which side they served. Government officials criticized the film for suggesting ordinary French people actively chose sides rather than being victims of circumstance. The film's most powerful scene shows a doctor who regularly crosses the line to treat patients being forced by both sides to spy on the other, representing the impossible position of those trying to remain neutral. Critics praised Jean Seberg's performance as a woman helping Jews escape, though some called the film too ambiguous in its judgments. Chabrol deliberately shot in black and white when color was standard. Memories of occupation aren't in color. They exist in the gray zone of moral compromise. The film's unflattering portrayal of rural French life led to it being rarely screened on television and largely forgotten until recent restorations. Papy fait de la résistance, Grandpa was in the Resistance, delivered the most subversive French World War II film by disguising it as a madcap farce, a comedy that did more to expose resistance mythology than many serious films. Following a family of musicians who reluctantly hide a resistance fighter in Nazi-occupied Paris, the film uses absurdist humor to highlight the often self-serving narratives that emerged after liberation. The film's most controversial aspect? Showing how everyone claimed resistance credentials after the war, joke that the incompetent grandfather never did anything heroic but receives a medal anyway. Christian Clavier's performance as Super Resistant, a ridiculous resistance fighter who appears in full superhero regalia, directly mocks the post-war mythologizing of resistance activities. Critics initially dismissed it as mere slapstick, missing its cutting commentary on historical revisionism. The film became a massive commercial hit with over 4.1 million tickets sold, much to the dismay of officials who maintained more dignified resistance narratives. Its most pointed scene shows neighbors fighting over who was more resistant at a post-liberation party, exactly what happened across France after the Germans left. Director Poiret later said, "Sometimes comedy tells more truth than drama." Everyone laughed because everyone knew someone who suddenly remembered their resistance activities in 1945. Un héros très discret, a self-made hero, in 1996. Jacques Audiard crafted a devastating satire about post-war myth-making through the story of Albert de Hoos, a nobody who reinvents himself as a resistance hero after the liberation. Mathieu Kassovitz plays the ultimate opportunist to construct a heroic past he never had, eventually becoming celebrated and appointed to government positions based entirely on fabrications. The film's most uncomfortable truth? Many celebrated resistance members similarly exaggerated or invented their war records, a reality government officials and veterans groups tried suppressing. Based on Jean-François Deniau's novel, itself inspired by real cases, the film suggests France's post-war identity was built on convenient fictions rather than honest confrontation with widespread accommodation of Nazi rule. Critics praised its daring premise, with Kassovitz winning Best Actor at Cannes. The film's most biting scene shows real resistance veterans accepting Albert into their ranks because his false stories align with the heroic narrative they prefer. As writer Emmanuel Carrère noted, the film's genius is showing how nations need myths more than truth after trauma. Audiard received anonymous threats from self-proclaimed resistance associations accusing him of dishonoring true heroes, proving the film's central point about France's inability to separate resistance fact from fiction. La Rafale, the Roundup. 2010. Rose Bosch shattered 60 years of silence by recreating the Vel de Hiv Roundup with unflinching detail, showing French police arresting 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, and holding them in inhumane conditions before deportation to death camps. The film follows actual historical figures, including Dr. David Scheinbaum, Protestant nurse Annette Monod, who witnessed the Roundup firsthand. What authorities found unconscionable? The film directly implicates the French police and government, showing them exceeding even Nazi demands by arresting children the Germans hadn't initially requested. Until the 1990 seconds, French presidents denied official French involvement, blaming everything on German occupiers. Created the demolished Velodrome de Hiver cycling stadium, where Jews were held without food or water for days, a site deliberately destroyed after the war to erase evidence. Critics debated whether the film's emotional approach undermined its historical significance, though Jewish organizations praised its educational impact. President Jacques Chirac's 1995 speech, acknowledging French responsibility, shown in the film's epilogue, came after 50 years of official denial. Most devastating is learning that of the 4,000 children shown being separated from parents and deported alone, not a single one survived. As director Bosch stated, "This isn't a Jewish tragedy. It's a French tragedy that must be taught in every school." Elle s'appelait Sarah, Sarah's Key, Rosnay's best-selling novel, into a gut-wrenching drama connecting modern-day journalist Julia, played by Kristen Scott Thomas, with Sarah, a Jewish girl arrested during the WWII Roundup, who locked her younger brother in a closet, promising to return. The film jumps between 1942 and 2009, showing how France's buried wartime secrets continue haunting the present. What made this film uniquely controversial was its suggestion that properties stolen from deported Jews remained in French hands for generations, with current owners knowing but suppressing their homes' dark histories. The production faced resistance from neighborhood associations when filming in locations where actual roundups occurred, with residents complaining it would damage property values. To highlight such connections, critics praised its emotional impact, while some historians criticized its fictional elements. The film's most devastating revelation comes when Julia discovers Sarah's ultimate fate and must decide whether to expose a family's carefully maintained lies. When released in France, several elderly viewers actually came forward, confessing to living in homes they knew had been seized from deported Jews. As Scott Thomas explained in interviews, "This isn't just historical drama, it's about our continuing responsibility to acknowledge how we benefit from past crimes." Les Femmes de l'Ombre, Female Agents, delivered the long-suppressed story of women resistance fighters, focusing on a team of female SOE Special Operations Executive agents parachuted into occupied France on a mission to rescue a British geologist from German hands before D-Day. Led by Sophie Marceau's character, loosely based on resistance hero Lise Villemeur, these women use their perceived harmlessness to accomplish what male agents cannot. The film's most shocking aspect? Revealing how female resistance members faced unique brutality, including sexual violence during Gestapo interrogations, while receiving little post-war recognition compared to male counterparts. Military historians actively worked against the film, claiming it exaggerated women's resistance roles, despite evidence of over 3,000 female SOE agents with higher success rates than men. Critics were divided on its blend of action and historical drama, though it became a box office success with over 2 million admissions in France. The film's most powerful scene shows resistance women being awarded medals after the war, but denied veteran status and benefits that male fighters received automatically. As Marceau stated in interviews, "These women weren't just support staff. They killed, spied, and died, exactly like men. But history erased them, because France wasn't comfortable with women who didn't fit victim narratives." The film triggered a parliamentary review of female resistance veterans' status, leading to expanded recognition decades overdue. These aren't just movies. They're historical reckonings that forced France to confront what really happened during those dark years. Which of these hidden classics shocked you the most? Did the French government have the right to suppress these films to protect national unity, or was this censorship just another form of collaboration with the past? The most uncomfortable question remains, would you have been a hero, a collaborator, or like most French citizens, someone who simply looked away while their neighbors disappeared? Lacombe, Lucien, 1974. Louis Malle dropped a cultural bomb on French mythology with his unflinching portrait of an ordinary peasant boy who joins the Gestapo not from ideology, but from sheer opportunism and boredom. Malle's most provocative choice? Portraying the main character as neither monster nor victim, but an amoral teenager enjoying his sudden power over others, including the Jewish family he simultaneously protects and terrorizes. The film triggered nationwide outrage for suggesting that collaboration wasn't just the domain of intellectual elites and political extremists, but ordinary rural Frenchman. Mal received death threats and was accused of spitting on the memory of the resistance. The young actor who played Lucien, Pierre Blaise, was a non-professional Mal, discovered working as a woodcutter. Blaise died in a car accident shortly after the film's release, having never acted again. Critics were divided.